welcome back to the workshop. So we got kind of a weird one today. This project kind of fell in my lap. It's a 80s Toyota 4x4. The engine, which is not one of these two sitting here, actually broke, and it was pulled apart, and now here it is. We have a replacement engine that's been that was rebuilt, sourced over the internet, and it's been sitting for basically 6 months. The person that took it apart has no idea how to put it back together, so here we are kind of picking up the pieces. One of the first things I noted was the exhaust manifold was sitting partially bolted up, but you couldn't get it all the way bolted up. And what ended up happening is the original engine, the studs had been broken off, and they got the correct studs to go into the head, but they got the wrong bolts to go with it. So I've sourced some new bolts. One of the studs I had to very carefully cut the cross-threaded nut off of it and then rethread the last little bit of it. These two studs had to be rethreaded, but all these studs were completely bottomed out. So I pulled all but this one. This one's trying to take the helicoil out of the head, so I'm just going to leave that one alone. But the rest of these we're going to anti-seize, put them in right. Also, the gasket surface here has not been prepared correctly, so we're going to go through, correct that. I've been slowly picking through the different parts and trying to find the bolts that go with each part and kind of putting it together. Because again, it's a puzzle. Alright, now with this one, we're going to take and just scrape whatever we can scrape off with a razor blade just to get it started. So unfortunately, there's quite a bit of scale and nastiness on here.
When you're using a file to clean up a manifold like this, you want to make sure you're putting very even pressure across the face of the file. You don't want to shave away an edge on the manifold itself. And same thing when I'm doing the paper, I'm just trying to remove the scale and not remove any of the base material. Unfortunately, this file that I originally selected wasn't quite coarse enough to grab a hold of the rust and actually peel it away, so I switched out after a few minutes of attempting to clean it up.
So there is a little bit of distortion in this manifold. It's got a high spot right in here, and then it's low on these outer corners. Now ultimately the gasket is pretty thick, so it would be fine with that. Ideally, we would actually set this up in a fixture and then actually plane this off in a mill. That'd be the right way to do it. I don't have that capability at this time, otherwise I would. But really, it's only out by probably 10-15 thousandths on these outer corners. So it'll be fine for the gasket that it has. It probably won't even leak at all. So we're gonna get this on next. Okay, now what we're gonna do to start this, we're going to take these studs, we're going to thread a couple just sacrificial nuts on there. They'll go on. Oh, come on. Of course, it's going to fight me now that I'm trying to do it on camera. Okay. So we're just going to snug up these two nuts so we have something to drive it in. We're going to take our bottle of anti-seize, just give it a little dab, just enough to thread it in. And with these, you don't have to go all the way to the bottom. Just go till they're snug. That's it. And they'll be whatever they'll be in the end. Okay. Take the two nuts off. Wash, rinse, and repeat. Is we're going to break out the anti-seize, just put a blob on every single one of these studs. Because it'll make taking this thing apart, if the need was ever there, a lot easier. And I'm sure the next guy in line is really going to appreciate that. Alright, so we got a blob on all these spots. Go ahead and stick this together. So that goes on. Now I got one oddball fastener. I'm going to put that little guy right in the middle, because unfortunately the store I went to did not have enough fasteners to go around. So that's all getting to be on there. And somewhere around here is my razor blade, so I can actually open these packages without having to rip and tear so badly. Alright, so we just got this little oddball guy in the middle. That's the next size down. Because unfortunately these fasteners were bought at the local hardware store, not directly from Toyota. So Toyota did their own size of head, probably to save a couple cents here and there on every vehicle made. But what else is new? Okay, those are all good and tight. I'm going to look up the torque specs on these so we can actually put them to where they're supposed to be permanent like. Alright, so up next we got this little back cover here. I'm not entirely sure what it does, but it looks like it's got a heat exchanger, so it's got a hollow section that gets affected by the coolant that's running through this void here, and then it passes through to this side port over here. But one of the things I noticed as soon as I started scraping is this head's been repainted, which makes it look nice for for a rebuild. But now you got paint over a sealing surface. So we're just going to very lightly, as per always, don't sand too heavy. We're just trying to remove the paint and not disturb the metal. And I wouldn't normally go through an effort like this to clean this up, but this is going to have coolant on the other side of it, and we do not want that leaking out. Also going to take a little bit of gasket maker here. We're just going to run a very thin skim coat. Now with these holes, what I actually did to make sure they fit is, because I didn't know what bolts I had, I just knew that there was 5 of them. So when I dug through the pile of parts, I found 5 matching bolts that looked like they're the right thread and length. And then I measured into the bottom of the hole with a pair of calipers and figured out how much hole depth I had. And these bolts running through this housing gave me 2 millimeters of clearance on the shallowest hole. Then you add the gasket, so that gives about 3 millimeters before the bolt bottoms out, which allows these to run finger tight right down to where it's snug there. So no drag, no fighting, no big deal. And then we're going to just, as always, kind of work a crisscross pattern till these all get nice and tight. Now this is the same bolts as on the intake, and the intake calls for a 14 foot-pounds of torque. So I'm going to go get my torque wrench. I'm actually going to torque them to the same as the intake. It's the same bolts, everything should be pretty much the same. Alright, now of all the pieces to go on here, this is probably one of the most critical. And we're going to get all the bolts in place, and we're going to tighten this flange up first, because I definitely want that to be fully seated, locked down before we progress with everything else. The tube itself can actually shift a little bit. Now, one thing that I did do is I spent quite a bit of time cleaning this pickup tube, because the parts for this engine had been sitting out, so I didn't want any pine needles or anything else. Really, once this gets on and the pan gets on, then this engine's basically sealed up, and you're not going to risk getting a bunch of garbage in there. Anyway.
Whatever you're using to drive the bearing in, make sure it's just a little bit bigger than the bearing so you don't cause any damage to it. You want to just go down all the way flush. And then make sure you prep all your pressure plate and flywheel surfaces free of oil and grease, so that way it doesn't make hot spots or chatter or anything weird. And then once you've got a couple bolts just loosely in there, make sure that clutch disc is free and the alignment tool pulls out cleanly. If it doesn't pull out cleanly once you're done, it'll be very difficult to get the transmission on. So I keep routinely checking it as I go.
Well, this is where we're going to stop it for this video. The valve cover is still loose, but the only reason I have it there is so I can verify that we're at top dead center for when we set the distributor. But we'll probably do that when all this is in the hole, because I don't want to break the distributor while the engine's being installed. But we got the water pump on, we got the thermostat on. We're going to have to change out a couple sensors here. Put the carburetor on, but for the most part this engine's ready to just drop in the hole. So yeah, I guess next video we'll have this thing all being installed and then hopefully be running by the end of that video.